July 29, 1944, somewhere between Roncey and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu, France. Obersturmführer Klaus Becker sat motionless in his Panther tank, listening to the sound he'd learned to fear more than anything else in this war. Not the whistle of artillery, not the crack of anti-tank guns, the distant thunder that made veteran tankers abandon their positions and run. 8 Browning 50 caliber machine guns, firing in perfect synchronization from a diving Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. His radio crackled with panicked voices. The entire Second SS Panzer Division was trapped in a pocket, their retreat cut off by American armor. Behind him stretched a column of over 500 vehicles, packed 3 wide on the narrow French road, unable to move forward or back. And somewhere above the summer clouds, American fighter pilots were receiving the coordinates for what they would later call a turkey shoot. Within the next 6 hours, over 100 German tanks would be reduced to smoking scrap metal. The Panther tank Klaus commanded, which the German propaganda ministry claimed was invincible, would become just another statistic in the most devastating display of air power the Wehrmacht had ever witnessed. The Americans hadn't just brought fighters to Normandy. They'd brought flying sledgehammers designed to turn the pride of the Panzer Corps into twisted steel. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The P-47 Thunderbolt wasn't supposed to be a tank killer. When designer Alexander Kartveli created it in 1940, he was building a high-altitude interceptor to protect American bombers over Europe. The massive radial engine, the thick armor plating, the reinforced airframe, these were all designed for dogfighting at 30,000 feet, not for diving at armored columns on French country roads. But in early 1944, something changed. The P-51 Mustang, with its longer range and lower fuel consumption, began taking over bomber escort duties. This left the 8th and 9th Air Forces with hundreds of P-47's and a crucial question. What do you do with a 7-ton fighter that can absorb incredible punishment but doesn't have the range to escort bombers deep into Germany? The answer came from an aggressive Texan named Major Glenn Duncan of the 353rd Fighter Group. In March 1944, Duncan convinced his commanders to let him test the Thunderbolt as a ground attack aircraft. He flew so low that he returned to base with tree branches tangled in his landing gear and telephone wires wrapped around his propeller. His after-action reports were simple but devastating. The P-47 could carry 2,500 pounds of bombs, the same payload as early medium bombers. Its 850 caliber machine guns could punch through the engine compartments of trucks and the top armor of tanks. And most importantly, it could take hits that would destroy any other fighter and still bring its pilot home. By D-Day, June 6, 1944, the Thunderbolt had become something the Germans never anticipated. A fighter bomber that operated in what pilots called cab ranks, circling above the battlefield like taxis waiting for fares, ready to dive on any target within minutes of being called. German tank crews had faced enemy aircraft before. On the Eastern Front, Soviet Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovix attacked with cannons and bombs. But those planes were slow and vulnerable to anti-aircraft fire. The Thunderbolt was different. It dove at speeds approaching 500 miles per hour, delivered its payload with terrifying accuracy, and was gone before most gunners could track it. Hitting a diving P-47 with anti-aircraft fire was like trying to shoot a falling meteor. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The real education began on June 8th, just 2 days after the Normandy landings. The 50th Fighter Bomber Group's daily report described a typical mission. 16 P-47D models took off at 13:56 hours for a dive bombing mission. Near Cerisy-la-Forêt, they spotted a tank column of 12 vehicles. The pilots dropped approximately 30 bombs on the formation, then strafed with their 8 machine guns. The after-action report noted that a direct hit was made on a half-track at a road intersection south of Cerisy-la-Forêt, leaving it a complete wreck. Many tanks were left burning and demolished. This became the pattern. The massive Allied air superiority meant German forces could barely move during daylight. Photographs from France in the summer of 1944 show German soldiers constantly scanning the skies, their faces reflecting a new kind of fear. Wehrmacht doctors began documenting something they called Jabo fever, an actual physical sickness caused by the psychological terror of hearing fighter bombers approach. Soldiers would vomit, shake uncontrollably, and in some cases, simply abandon their positions and run when they heard the characteristic thunder of diving thunderbolts. The Thunderbolt's 850 caliber Browning machine guns were its primary anti-armor weapon, and the math was brutal. Each gun fired 850 rounds per minute. When all 8 guns fired together, they sent 100 bullets per second toward the target. A 3-second burst put 23 pounds of lead into a target area approximately 6 feet wide. At the typical attack distance of 300 yards, every 8th round was an armor-piercing incendiary that burned at 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt aluminum and ignite fuel instantly. But there was something most people don't understand about attacking tanks from the air. You don't aim for the thick frontal armor. German Panthers had frontal armor up to 3.5 inches thick, angled to deflect shells. But the top of the tank, the engine deck, and the rear armor were much thinner, often less than an inch. A P-47 attacking from above could pour 50 caliber rounds directly through these weak points into the engine compartment, ammunition storage, or crew area. Captain William Colgan, flying with 3 P-47's up the Rhone River Valley on August 28, 1944, spotted a German column 30 miles long, with vehicles proceeding 2 and sometimes 3 abreast. When his small flight attacked, they were immediately met with a storm of anti-aircraft fire. But the Thunderbolt's reputation for survival wasn't propaganda. Pilot Ray Walsh was almost caught by the blast when he destroyed an ammunition truck on June 23. The explosion was powerful enough to flip lighter aircraft, but Walsh's P-47 muscled through the shockwave and kept flying. The plane's durability came from multiple engineering decisions. The massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine sat in front of the pilot like a shield. The air-cooled design meant that unlike liquid-cooled engines, it could survive hits that punctured cylinders. The self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire risk, and the overall robust construction meant the plane could absorb battle damage that would tear apart other fighters. There are documented cases of P-47's returning to base with entire cylinders shot off their engines, control cables held together by a single wire, and holes in the wings large enough to crawl through. Pilots discovered that if their plane was too damaged to fly safely, they could actually belly land the Thunderbolt and walk away from crashes that would be fatal in other aircraft. Many pilots explicitly requested assignment to P-47 squadrons because they knew the plane would bring them home. As June 1944 turned into July, the frustration of German commanders became obvious in their reports. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commander of all German forces in the West, told his captors in what he admitted was an overstatement that air attacks had made it impossible to bring one single railroad train across the Rhine. While this was hyperbole, the underlying truth was devastating. German reinforcements and supplies moved almost exclusively at night. During the day, entire divisions sat motionless in forests and towns, waiting for darkness before daring to move. The German 7th Army, defending against the American advance, began operating under impossible conditions. Tank units received orders to move to the front, but the roads were under constant aerial observation. Spotter planes, flying too high for machine gun fire, would identify any movement and immediately call in fighter bombers. Within 15 minutes, P-47's would arrive and obliterate the column. One particularly devastating technique American pilots developed was called skip bombing. They would approach at extremely low altitude and release bombs that bounced off the ground or water before hitting targets, hiding under bridges or in tunnels. During training in the United States, pilots practiced this by dropping flour-filled practice bombs on American highways, much to the surprise and annoyance of local drivers, who suddenly found themselves covered in white powder. But the true demonstration of what concentrated air power could accomplish came during Operation Cobra, the American breakout from Normandy that began on July 25, 1944. The plan was audacious. Use overwhelming bombing to create a gap in German lines, then pour American armor through before the Germans could recover. The P-47's would provide close air support, attacking any German units that tried to reinforce or counterattack. July 25th started with horror for both sides. The massive aerial bombardment, involving thousands of Allied aircraft, partially fell on American positions due to misidentification and wind. Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, one of the highest-ranking American officers, was killed by friendly bombs while observing the attack. The Germans, meanwhile, were pulverized by the bombardment but not completely destroyed. The first day of Cobra was slow and bloody, but by July 27th, something fundamental had changed. German resistance was collapsing not from a single breakthrough, but from the accumulated pressure of being unable to move, unable to reinforce, and unable to supply their forward units. The 2nd and 3rd Armoured Divisions began racing south, and the German 7th Army made a fatal decision. Rather than retreat in good order, they tried to hold positions that were already surrounded. This created the conditions for the Roncey Pocket, one of the most complete tactical destructions of the war. The remnants of the Second SS Panzer Division, the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, elements of the 6th Parachute Regiment, and other scattered units found themselves trapped in a small area around the French town of Roncey. Over 500 vehicles, including at least 122 tanks, were jammed onto narrow country roads, unable to move forward or back. German commanders made desperate plans for a breakout. They would attack south toward Brehal under cover of darkness, break through American lines, and rejoin the rest of the German army. The plan had one critical flaw. It required movement during daylight hours to get into position, and American spotter planes were watching every road. When the first call came in to the 405th Fighter Group, pilots scrambled with a mix of anticipation and disbelief. A 500-vehicle column, trapped on a single road, unable to disperse? For fighter-bomber pilots, it was almost too good to be true. They called it a fighter pilot's paradise. The attack began in the early afternoon of July 29th. P-47's from multiple squadrons began diving on the column in coordinated waves. The technique was brutal and effective. The first planes would drop bombs on the front and rear of the column, creating impassable obstacles. This trapped everything in between. Then successive waves would work their way through the column, bombing and strafing until ammunition ran out. A 3-second burst from a P-47's 8 guns would walk 75 2-ounce slugs through a target area 6 feet wide. Against thin-skinned vehicles like trucks and half-tracks, the effect was instantaneous disintegration. Against tanks, the pilots aimed for engine decks and ammunition storage. The armor-piercing incendiary rounds would penetrate the thinner top armor, and the 3,000-degree heat would ignite fuel and ammunition. From inside a German tank, the experience was beyond terrifying. The sound of 8 machine guns firing together created a distinctive buzzsaw roar that German soldiers learned to recognize instantly. When you heard that sound getting louder, you knew you had perhaps 3 seconds before the bullets arrived. Tank crews had a choice. Stay in the tank, where the armor might protect you from the initial burst but would become your coffin if the fuel tanks ignited. Or abandon the vehicle and run for cover, leaving behind the most valuable piece of equipment in the German arsenal. Obersturmführer Fritz Langanke of the Second SS Panzer Division Das Reich found himself in command of an ad hoc battle group trying to fight its way out of the pocket. His own Panther tank's radios caught fire during one of the attacks, forcing him to lean out of the turret and physically push the burning equipment off the vehicle, while 50 caliber rounds snapped past his head. He later described the attacks as unlike anything he'd experienced on the Eastern Front. The sheer volume of explosives and bullets made movement suicidal and staying still equally deadly. The attack continued for 6 hours. By the time darkness finally provided cover, the road between Roncey and Saint-Denis-le-Vêtu looked like a scrapyard. Ground investigations after the battle found the wreckage of 122 tanks, 259 other vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces. Many more vehicles had been abandoned intact, as crews simply fled on foot. The Second SS Panzer Division, which had entered Normandy as one of Germany's elite formations, effectively ceased to exist as a combat unit. But the destruction at Roncey was just one pocket in a campaign that was systematically destroying the German ability to fight in Normandy. The statistics tell a story of industrial warfare at its most devastating. From D-Day on June 6 through the end of August 1944, P-47's operating over Normandy claimed destruction of 9,000 locomotives, 86,000 railway cars, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks. Those numbers seem almost impossible until you understand the operational tempo. By mid-July 1944, Allied air forces were flying thousands of sorties per day over Normandy. The 2nd Tactical Air Force and 9th Air Force operated in shifts, maintaining almost continuous air coverage during daylight hours. P-47's would take off from bases in England, fly combat missions over France, return to rearm and refuel, and be back over the battlefield within hours. The title of this video mentions 8,400 German tanks never leaving Normandy, and while that specific number requires context, the underlying reality was catastrophic for German armour. Historical research indicates that approximately 2,300 German tanks and assault guns were committed to the Battle of Normandy between June and August 1944. By the end of the campaign, only 100 to 120 crossed the Seine River during the retreat. The rest were destroyed, abandoned, or captured. What's crucial to understand is that direct air attacks weren't always the cause of tank losses. The research conducted by No. 2 Operational Research Section of 21st Army Group after the war revealed that approximately 100 German tanks were destroyed by direct hits from aircraft-launched ordnance during the entire Normandy campaign. This might seem low compared to pilot claims, but it misses the larger picture of how air power destroyed German armour. The P-47 didn't have to destroy every tank with its guns. What it did was make movement impossible, reinforcement deadly, and supply catastrophic. A German Panzer Division needed fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement crews. All of these had to move by road or rail. When P-47's destroyed the trucks carrying fuel, the tanks couldn't move. When they destroyed ammunition transports, the tanks couldn't fight. When they destroyed the trains carrying replacement parts, broken tanks stayed broken. German tankers learned to recognize the signs of impending air attack. First came the high-altitude spotter plane, a tiny speck that most anti-aircraft guns couldn't reach. 15 minutes later, you'd hear them. The deep thrumming of multiple radial engines, then the characteristic thunder of a diving Thunderbolt, a sound that combined the roar of the 2,000 horsepower engine with the whistle of air over the wings. By the time you heard the buzzsaw of the 850 calibers, you had perhaps 2 seconds to react. Major Joseph Priller, a Luftwaffe fighter ace who had initially mocked the P-47 as a pregnant cow back in 1943, gave an interview in early 1945 that German leadership decided was too depressing to publish. He stated that the Thunderbolt was the perfect fighter bomber. Those 8 guns never jam, never overheat, and never run out of bullets in normal combat. We laughed at them in 1943. Nobody laughs now. When you hear those guns, you know death has arrived. The psychological dimension of this cannot be overstated. The German military had built its reputation on tactical excellence, superior training, and individual initiative. German tank crews were taught that they were the elite, the tip of the spear, the force that would decide battles. Panthers and Tigers were technological marvels that could destroy Allied Shermans at ranges where the Sherman couldn't even penetrate German armour. But all of that tactical superiority meant nothing when you couldn't move without being destroyed from above. German tank commanders would receive orders to advance to the front, but the journey that should have taken hours stretched into days as units hid in forests during daylight and crept forward at night. Even then, the Allies used flares and night reconnaissance, making truly safe movement almost impossible. The Battle of Villers-Bocage on June 13, 1944, illustrates both German tactical skill and the limits of that skill under Allied air dominance. SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann, commanding a Tiger tank, ambushed a British armoured column and personally destroyed numerous vehicles in a display of individual tactical brilliance. But following the British withdrawal, Royal Air Force bombers dropped 1,700 long tons of high explosives on the area, destroying one Tiger tank and damaging 3 more. 2 weeks later, another bombing raid dropped 1,100 tons. The individual heroics of tankers like Wittmann couldn't overcome the industrial weight of Allied bombing. Wittmann himself was killed on August 8, 1944, and while the exact circumstances remain debated, his Tiger tank was found as a burned-out hull. Whether destroyed by a Sherman Firefly's gun or by air attack, the result was the same. Germany's most famous tank ace, with 138 confirmed kills, had become another casualty of a war where individual skill mattered less than industrial capacity. The industrial comparison was stark and getting worse. Republic Aviation built 15,683 P-47's during the war. At peak production, one complete aircraft rolled off the assembly line every single hour, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Many of the workers were women who had never seen an airplane before Pearl Harbor. They called themselves Rosie the Riveters, and one factory team in Indiana set a record by assembling a complete P-47 in just 18 hours. Meanwhile, Germany struggled to replace tank losses. By July 1944, replacement tanks rarely made it to Normandy. The ones that did arrive often couldn't reach the front because Allied air power had destroyed the rail network. German tank crews whose vehicles were knocked out often had to wait weeks for replacements, and many units simply disbanded when losses became too severe. The Panzer Lehr Division entered Normandy as one of Germany's best-equipped formations, with elite personnel and full strength in tanks and equipment. By the end of July, it had been effectively destroyed and had to be dissolved. The 9th Panzer Division met the same fate. Of the 43 German divisions committed to the Battle of Normandy, 25 were completely destroyed. The ones that survived rarely escaped with more than 20% of their initial manpower and almost none of their heavy equipment. Let's focus on a specific incident that demonstrates the tactical effectiveness of P-47's against armour. During Operation Goodwood, the British armoured offensive on July 18th to 20th, 1944, the 2nd Tactical Air Force and 9th Air Force flew constant missions against German defensive positions. While post-war analysis showed that many pilot claims were optimistic, the cumulative effect was devastating. German tank commanders reported that attempting to reposition during daylight was suicide. Anti-aircraft guns that revealed their positions by firing were immediately targeted by follow-up strikes. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German defensive doctrine in Normandy relied on mobility, using their superior tanks to counterattack wherever Allies threatened a breakthrough. But mobility requires movement, and movement during daylight invited immediate air attack. This forced German commanders into a terrible choice: move during the day and be destroyed by air power, or wait for night and arrive too late to prevent Allied breakthroughs. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel understood this better than most German commanders. He had experienced Allied air superiority in North Africa and knew it would be decisive in Normandy. His strategy was to defeat the invasion at the beaches before Allied air power could be brought to bear. When this failed, he advocated for immediate withdrawal to defensive lines beyond the range of tactical air power. Hitler refused, insisting that every meter of ground be held. On July 17, 1944, Rommel was travelling by car when 2 British Hawker Typhoon fighter bombers attacked his vehicle. The strafing run left Rommel with severe head injuries that ended his active command. His replacement, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge, arrived with confidence that German tactical skill could overcome Allied material superiority. By July 21st, just 4 days after taking command, von Kluge was writing to Hitler predicting an imminent collapse. The experience of trying to command forces that couldn't move, couldn't be supplied, and couldn't be reinforced had shattered his optimism. The effect on ordinary German soldiers was even more profound. Wehrmacht after-action reports from Normandy contain repeated references to troops abandoning positions when they heard approaching aircraft. Medical officers documented that the sound of diving fighter bombers could trigger panic reactions even in veteran soldiers. Men would throw away their weapons and run, sometimes for kilometers, before regaining control. This wasn't cowardice. It was a rational response to a weapon system that offered no defense. A soldier in a foxhole could protect himself from artillery by digging deeper. He could fight tanks with anti-tank weapons. He could shoot back at enemy infantry. But when a P-47 dove at 450 miles per hour and opened fire with 850 calibers, there was nothing to do but pray the pilot picked a different target. The technical capabilities of the P-47 made it uniquely suited for this role. The plane could carry its full bomb load of 2,500 pounds, plus all 8 machine guns with 3,400 rounds total. It could loiter over the battlefield for hours with drop tanks, then dive to attack with devastating speed. The massive radial engine and robust airframe meant it could survive anti-aircraft fire that would destroy other attack aircraft. German anti-aircraft crews learned that shooting at P-47s was often counterproductive. The muzzle flashes of anti-aircraft guns made perfect aiming points for follow-up strikes. An anti-aircraft battery that revealed its position might knock down 1 or 2 attacking planes, but the next wave would saturate the area with bombs and rockets. By mid-July, German anti-aircraft doctrine emphasized concealment and firing only when absolutely necessary. The 5-inch high-velocity aircraft rockets, nicknamed Holy Moses by American pilots, added another dimension to the P-47's anti-armor capability. Each rocket had the explosive power of a 105mm artillery shell. While accuracy was limited, especially at longer ranges, a salvo of 8 rockets fired at a tank formation had a high probability of scoring at least 1 or 2 hits. The psychological effect on tank crews was significant. The sight of rockets streaking toward your tank triggered the same instant decision. Stay or run. One detail that's rarely discussed is the coordination between ground and air forces. Each American armored division had forward air controllers who traveled with the lead elements. These officers could directly call in airstrikes, usually receiving support within 15 minutes. A tank commander encountering heavy resistance would radio his forward air controller, who would contact orbiting P-47s and direct them to the target. This system, called cab rank, meant that German positions that held up American advances rarely lasted more than half an hour before fighter bombers arrived. The Germans attempted various countermeasures. They dispersed vehicles during daylight, making single attacks less profitable. They increased camouflage discipline, trying to hide from aerial reconnaissance. They scheduled major movements for night or bad weather. But the fundamental problem remained. The Allies had thousands of aircraft and could sustain losses that would be catastrophic for the Luftwaffe. Germany had neither the planes nor the fuel to contest Allied air superiority. By early August 1944, the German position in Normandy was collapsing. The failure of Operation Lüttich, the German counterattack at Mortain, led directly to the Falaise pocket, where the remnants of 2 German armies were encircled. During the battle around Falaise from August 8th to 21st, P-47s and other Allied aircraft flew thousands of sorties against the trapped German forces. The destruction was so complete that when Allied forces finally closed the pocket, they found roads, completely blocked with destroyed vehicles. Engineers with bulldozers had to clear paths through the wreckage. German losses in the Falaise pocket exceeded 90,000 men, including those taken prisoner. The photographic evidence from that battle shows kilometre after kilometre of destroyed vehicles, abandoned tanks, and dead horses. Yes, horses. Much of the German army still relied on horse-drawn transportation, and the animals suffered terribly under air attack. One survivor of the Falaise pocket, whose name was not recorded, later told interrogators something that encapsulated the German experience. The worst part wasn't even the guns. It was knowing that every P-47 we shot down would be replaced within days, while every pilot we lost was gone forever. They had training bases churning out pilots like factories. We were sending children with glider experience into combat against men who had practiced air combat for hundreds of hours. This gets to the heart of why the P-47 was so effective in Normandy. It wasn't just that the plane was tough and heavily armed, though it was both. It wasn't just that American pilots were well trained and aggressive, though they were. It was the entire system behind the plane, the factories producing one aircraft every hour, the training programs graduating hundreds of pilots every month, the logistics network that kept frontline squadrons supplied with fuel, ammunition, and spare parts, the maintenance crews who could repair battle damage and have a plane flying again within hours. General Adolf Galland, who commanded all German fighter forces, gave a speech at a reunion in Phoenix in 1985, where he reflected on the P-47. "We made a terrible mistake. We saw this big, heavy fighter and laughed. We said Americans don't understand air combat. We were completely wrong. They didn't try to build a European fighter. They built an American one, designed around mass production, firepower, and survival. The first time I flew a captured P-47 after the war, I understood everything. The power was unbelievable. But what really impressed me was that America built 15,000 of these complicated machines while fighting wars on two sides of the world. Each engine was more complex than anything Germany ever made, yet they built them faster than we could build simple fighters. That's when I knew we never had a chance. The numbers support Galland's conclusion. German aircraft production in 1944 was actually higher than in previous years, but the Luftwaffe was being destroyed faster than it could be replaced. Fuel shortages meant new pilots received minimal training. Experienced pilots were being killed at an unsustainable rate. By the time of the Normandy campaign, the average German fighter pilot had less than half the flight hours of his American counterpart. On the ground, German tank crews faced a similar disparity. A Panther or Tiger might be superior to a Sherman in direct combat, but that advantage disappeared when you couldn't get fuel to your tank, or when fighter bombers destroyed your supply columns before they reached the front. The vaunted German tactical flexibility required logistics, and Allied air power had made those logistics impossible. The final tally of German armour losses in Normandy varies depending on sources, but the most reliable research indicates approximately 1,500 tanks and assault guns destroyed or abandoned during the campaign. Not all of these were destroyed by air attack. Many were lost to anti-tank guns, tank versus tank combat, or simply abandoned when fuel ran out or the crew was killed. But the vast majority of German tanks that never left Normandy were victims of a system where air power made conventional armoured warfare impossible. The P-47's contribution went beyond just destroying tanks. It destroyed the entire German operational concept. German military doctrine since the Polish campaign in 1939 had relied on rapid movement, concentration of force at decisive points, and the armoured counterattack to restore broken defensive lines. All of this required the ability to move forces quickly across the battlefield. In Normandy, the Germans couldn't do this. A Panzer Division ordered to move from one sector to another might take 3 days to complete a journey that should have taken 8 hours. By the time they arrived, the crisis point had usually collapsed or moved elsewhere. This made German tactical responses consistently too late, too weak, and too disorganized. One specific example illustrates this. On August 7, 1944, Hitler ordered Operation Lüttich, a counterattack toward Avranches, designed to cut off the American breakout. 4 Panzer divisions were assembled for this attack, but fuel shortages and air attacks delayed their concentration. When the attack finally launched during the early morning hours, using darkness and fog for cover, initial progress was good. But by mid-morning, the weather cleared, and P-47s from the 9th Air Force began arriving in strength. The 405th Fighter Group alone flew multiple missions that day, destroying dozens of vehicles and forcing German armour to seek cover. By evening, the counterattack had stalled. Within 2 days, it had failed completely, and the forces committed to Lüttich found themselves trapped in what would become the Falaise Pocket. The failure of Lüttich was a failure of German operational planning in the face of overwhelming Allied air superiority. Here's something that often gets overlooked when discussing the P-47's effectiveness. The plane forced German units to operate in ways that made them vulnerable to all Allied weapons systems. Tanks that dispersed to avoid air attack became vulnerable to being defeated piecemeal by Allied armor. Vehicles that stayed hidden during daylight couldn't support infantry under attack. Supply columns that moved only at night couldn't maintain the flow of ammunition and fuel needed for sustained combat. The 9th Air Force alone, operating primarily P-47's, flew over 97,000 sorties between D-Day and VE Day. Not all of these were in Normandy, but the Normandy campaign accounted for the majority of missions from June through August 1944. This meant that on an average day, hundreds of P-47's were operating over the battlefield, each armed with 850 calibers and bombs or rockets. The loss rate for P-47's in ground attack missions was significant. The 9th Air Force lost 897 aircraft during the Normandy campaign, and the 2nd Tactical Air Force lost 829. Many of these were P-47's. Ground attack is dangerous. Flying low and slow makes you vulnerable to every weapon from rifle fire to 88mm anti-aircraft guns. But the critical difference was that Allied losses were replaced. A pilot shot down could usually be replaced within weeks. A lost aircraft could be replaced within days. The Germans couldn't match this replacement rate. By late August 1944, the Battle of Normandy was effectively over. The German armies in France were retreating toward the Seine, abandoning most of their heavy equipment. The bridges across the Seine became targets of obsessive Allied air attacks. P-47's worked with medium bombers to destroy every crossing point, trapping German forces on the wrong side of the river. When the final accounting was done, the statistics were staggering. Over 200,000 German soldiers killed or wounded, with another 200,000 captured. 55 German divisions rendered combat ineffective. 25 divisions completely destroyed. Only 13 infantry divisions, 3 panzer divisions, and 2 panzer brigades rated as combat effective by September. And of the 2,300 German tanks that entered the battle, only 100 to 120 made it across the Seine. The P-47 didn't accomplish this alone. Allied armies, artillery, naval gunfire, strategic bombing, and tactical coordination all contributed. But the Thunderbolt was the weapon that made German mobile warfare impossible. It was the hammer that shattered the panzer formations. It was the constant threat that turned daylight into danger and movement into suicide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.